Tired of video games? Burned out on mass destruction? Forget the game. Relax in Doodle City. This is episode 342 of Insert Credit, an asynchronous episode to accommodate everyone's schedules this week, where everyone recorded their answers separately, and yet we maintain the artifice of a horrible buzzer. I'm Alex Jaffe, and the first time I rolled credits on a video game was on Super Mario Land 2, 6 golden coins.
I'm Frank Cifaldi, and the first video game I rolled credits on was, I can't remember the name offhand. I think it's Bugs Bunny's Birthday Blowout, which sounds like a really bad situation for Bugs Bunny, but I think it was meant to be like blowout, like celebration, not anything firearm related. I think they should make a sequel called Bugs Bunny's Birthday Burnout. Could either be about like driving a car really fast or like he's just working too hard. I don't know where I'm going with this. You should cut this out.
I'm Brandon Sheffield, and this is an interesting question because the first games I played were on Intellivision and didn't have any credits. But I bet it was something like Super Mario Bros. 3, probably. That's the first game that I can remember being able to beat by myself without any help or Game Genie codes. And despite my best efforts and Game Genie usage, I could never beat Bayou Billy. I certainly tried. Also, though it is an asynchronous episode, I've got my dog barking, just to make it feel a little more familiar. So I hope that's okay with everybody. Please enjoy Pocket barking.
I'm Critical Kate Willaert, and the first video game I rolled credits on was X-Men Arcade, though I think I actually joined a game that was already in progress, so I'm not sure if that counts.
First question. What kinds of video game history seem to interest you and nobody else?
I've talked about this on the show before, probably, but I'm really fascinated by the persistence of the technology in the original Famicom, the NES. This is a chipset, a system that through weird circumstances and evolving markets and stuff has been a commercially viable video game chipset since 1983. That's 41 years and counting so far of this thing being something that one could write commercial software for. This, of course, starts with, the release of the Famicom in Japan, 83. It eventually gets sold around the world. The commercial life, the last official NES game, with a Nintendo seal on it or whatever, is 1995. I think it was Aladdin or something. And then as that's happening, there's actually an evolving market in parts of the world where consoles aren't legally sold, places like Russia and Hong Kong and occasionally even Brazil, although they were starting to get official distribution there. So in those places, there were clones of the Famicom, and those players needed new software in addition to the pirated versions of the official stuff. So you start seeing weird like 16-bit downports, and even in China, you start seeing original like RPGs that are only for the Famicom in China. And then as that's dying down, this new market starts emerging, the plug-and-play toy market. So if you remember things like, that joystick you could buy that just has Miss Pac-Man on it or whatever. Well, in about 2002, 2003, that becomes a major toy category in the United States. And you start seeing, and the thing is that like by then the clones of the Famicom, which by the way were made for educational computers in China for a long time too, become like the cheapest computer one could manufacture. You get NES on a chip for like pennies. So they start putting them in these toys, and for a few years you see these joysticks that have brand new NES games inside of them, but they're not marketed as NES. That's just the de facto cheap computer. My favorite is that there's one by Konami that has like brand new Konami NES games in 2003 or something like that. I think, what was new on there? Frogger. Like Frogger for NES came out in 2003. And by the time that's going, a couple years later, the homebrew market is starting to really fire up because the tools have evolved to the point where people can make decent commercial games. And there have been new commercial homebrew games really since then. So 41 years and counting of this chipset being commercially viable, not just like, free homebrew stuff on the internet or whatever, like commercially viable stuff. As long as you think beyond the history that like Nintendo provides, if you think of the soul of the Famicom as something that lives on in clones and in computers advertised by Jackie Chan.
I think all video game history can be interesting to everyone if packaged well. That's the whole point of things that Frank and I were trying to do with Digital Eclipse. I bet he talked about that. I'm interested in the FM Towns computer. I'm even more interested in games that worked across multiple Japanese microcomputers, like PC 98 to 88 to FM Towns to Sharp X68000. There were some games that, though the operating systems are not cross-compatible, would be available on all of these platforms at once. And I was really curious about this. And the trick is basically they're mostly visual novels with static screens where they just stored each of those screens in the correct resolutions 4 times and had 4 similar programs on the disk to operate them for each platform. And I feel like now that I've talked about it, that's probably interesting to someone and is not of interest to only me. What's most heartening to me is most of the time when I'm interested in a particular artifact, historical artifact of some kind, there's already someone who was more interested in it than I was and already started doing the research, which is nice. So I can actually add to things rather than having to start. There's always somebody out there ferreting out various niches, which used to be something that we were kind of at the forefront of in the early days of Insert Credit. And I think people really took the banner on that because, I don't know, you gotta dig down into things when you're not interested in what else is going on around you, I guess. I finally met somebody who's based in Korea who's dedicated to exploring and documenting the South Korean packaged game industry, which a lot of folks ignore or are embarrassed by or whatever. But it's a real trove of interesting stuff, which I talk about a lot on the show, like Ant-Man 2 and Lars the Wanderer from Hakyu Kim, or the Korum series, which is really good. There's just all this interesting stuff from the past there that gets brushed under the rug in favor of the MMOs and the free-to-play games and the mobile games and all this stuff. But I think people are sort of kind of going back to it now with the success of Dave the Diver and things. I've talked about Manic Game Girl here before, I think. That's the first PlayStation game made in Korea. And it was directed by a guy called Grant Han Lee, who worked on Parasite Eve previously, and then later worked on The Saboteur, which is really cool, but that's his last credit on Moby Games anyway, in 2009. So he worked in Japan, then went back to Korea and made Manic Game Girl, and then moved to the US and worked on like Full Spectrum Warrior and The Saboteur, and then disappeared from game credits after that. What's up with that? I'd love to know more about that guy. I think that's pretty interesting. It's probably interesting to other people also. I think the only stuff that truly only interests me and nobody else is the stuff that only I am thinking about in my head. And then once I vocalize it, somebody else is going to be interested, I'm pretty sure.
Video game box art. I'm absolutely fascinated by how box art came to look the way it does, and the stories of the people who were involved in the early experiments that got us there. I've written a few articles about the earliest box art, but it kind of sputtered out because it felt like there was a lack of interest. Getting people interested in pre-NES gaming history that isn't Atari is kind of an ongoing battle in general for a lot of us who research video game history. Because it's the most important decade due to it containing so many notable gaming firsts. But so few people have nostalgia for those games compared to the 80s that it's very difficult to get people interested. Now, some people will say, sure, but those games were ugly and not fun to play. But you have to keep in mind that that's also how people who didn't grow up with 8-bit games feel about 8-bit games, and how people who didn't grow up with PS1 games feel about PS1 games. I guess what I'm hoping is that one day there will be an audience as passionate about forgotten history as there currently is for lost media, but even the current lost media movement is largely driven by nostalgia. For example, I keep trying to raise awareness of a lost arcade game that not only featured the first playable female character, but was also the first game to include a gender select option. The game was called Score by a company called Exity, but currently we have no idea what the first female character looked like because no screenshots of the game exist and nobody currently owns a working cab. You'd think lost media fans would be all over this, but every time I've tried, it's just crickets. So, question number 2.
What are some of the most surprising video game firsts?
So I looked up video game film adaptations because I was curious, and I think it's actually really interesting that the first movie adaptation of a video game, both in the United States and in Japan, is an adaptation of Super Mario Brothers. And those two adaptations are 7 years apart. It's as if you cannot birth a film adaptation of video games industry without starting with Mario in any country. It does not depend on what year it is or whatever. So I like that one. I think that's fun. I guess, if we were all recording at the same time, I might bring up the surprising debate over what is the first video game, but I really liked the eventual answer after a fun journey on the Ahoy video, even though historians have since pointed out things that he missed. But I do like that he starts with, I don't know, Pong or something, and then ends with, I don't know, Pong, I think. So I really like that.
I hope Frank didn't take this one, but I think the most surprising video game firsts are the fake or false ones, like Tommy Tallarico being the first American to work on a Sonic game. All of those big, bold video game claims that turned out to be bogus, like the first person to, I don't know. I can't think of other fake ones right now, but they're surprising to me because of the hubris, I guess. I do think that competition to get your name on a tombstone that Shadow Man did, that was probably a first, and it was a little surprising, and it was designed to surprise, so it kind of works. One thing I've got halfway researched is the first twin-stick first-person shooter controls, another thing I've talked about on here, but basically a lot of games tried to make this happen around 1996 with Doom on the Saturn. Sorry, Quake, not Doom, Quake. And Turok, and on the N64, and to some extent GoldenEye, they all made different attempts within a pretty short period of time. The Saturn Quake was basically Smash TV style controls, and Turok was something quite similar, but it kind of made even more sense because you have those little direction-looking yellow guys on your controller there, along with your analog stick. And then GoldenEye had an option to use the analog sticks on 2 controllers at once to move the player and the camera independently. I think that's an interesting one to look into because it wouldn't actually be accepted as a control scheme until Halo. Alien Resurrection in 2000, which I talk about all the time, on the PlayStation had that, and reviewers hated it. They found it confusing, and it's wild to think about that now that it's become the standard. And I tend to be kind of more interested in the refinement of the idea than the actual first one. So to me, the most interesting of the bunch I mentioned is Alien Resurrection, which is why I keep talking about it, which took what those earlier games had done and made it into the standard that we know today, but to absolute critical revulsion. I think one interesting element here is there was a reviewer called Dan Jevons who suggested the Quake controls. I haven't been able to figure out if he played Turok first, because Turok actually came out first, and because they put it into Quake on the Saturn at the last minute and called them Jevons controls. And it's interesting to think that one reviewer may have had a significant influence, potentially, on the future of twin-stick game control, or just first-person shooting game controls on consoles for the future.
The first sexist video game ads are kind of surprising. not surprising that there was sexism, but how far it went. I was actually thinking about writing an article at one point about this one series of ads because there was one particular coin-op company where it seemed like a staffer was trying to see how far he could push things before anyone complained. And the final ad in the series involved cartoon violence against women, by which I mean like cartoon murdering women for sport. But I'm not sure anyone really wants to read about that. Not necessarily because the subject matter is so bleak, but because, it's pre-Nintendo. But as far as fun firsts that are surprising, I've done a lot of research on the history of storytelling in video games that might eventually see the light of day. And while everyone thinks they kind of know the bullet points of how storytelling in video games came to be, what I've discovered is that most people are wrong. Most people don't know. To give you one example, if I asked you what was the first game to include scripted sequences, which is industry jargon for cutscenes where you retain control of your character, most people would guess Half-Life, which isn't a bad guess. But the correct answer would be Atari Superman from 1979. To me, that was a real holy shit moment, and my research on storytelling in video games is full of these moments. But then I wonder, is it only a holy shit moment to me? How many people actually care about those earliest examples?
Which console has the most good games that the least people have played?
So I'm going to take this question very literally. The most good games that the least people have played. And I'm going to have to go somewhere where statistics are with me, where there's a lot of good games. And being that there's a lot of good games, not everyone's going to play all of them. So we can throw out anything from before the NES, because there were no good games before Super Mario Brothers, just like there were no good movies before Super Mario Brothers, the movie, the American one. So throw those out. NES maybe, but I actually think the libraries got larger in the Genesis and Super Nintendo days. And statistically, I think quantity of decent games is decent to bad games is probably about equal between like NES, Genesis, Super Nintendo. And then I think when you get to PlayStation, at least in my experience, the bad games get worse, maybe, or like there's more. I don't know. I might be wrong about that, but I think it's Genesis, Super Nintendo, or PlayStation. I don't have a lot of PlayStation experience, so I'm going to say between Super Nintendo and Genesis, statistically, you're most likely to see the most good games that the fewest people have played on the Super Nintendo. And that's final.
So for this one, you need a high volume of good games and a low number of players, I guess. So that would be consoles that didn't make it in the West, I think. So the PC Engine or Saturn would be the ones that come to mind first. PC Engine was the shooter console, but it also had a lot of early era RPGs with neat ideas and weird licensed games and stuff. Basically, nobody in the West could play the original Tengai Makyo until a few months ago when somebody made a translation patch along with a whole bunch of previously undocumented secrets, which is really cool. Then the Saturn had all the Sega arcade ports, RPGs, fighting games, 2D action, all that stuff that we always talk about, but it wasn't popular here. But thinking a little more about it, I guess a dark horse for this category in the future might be the Dreamcast. You can play Saturn games on the Mister now, and there's commercial emulators in use, like those, what do they call them, Saturn Tribute games and stuff that come out. But the Dreamcast will never make it to the Mister for power reasons. And I don't believe there's an emulator people can actually sell, and Sega isn't doing it. So maybe a console with a low number of users, a lot of good games, and which has a less robust emulation environment, commercial emulation environment, but also like FPGA style emulation environment is the one to go for. So yeah, I'm going to change my answer to Dreamcast.
The console with the most good games that the least people have played is definitely a machine that Wikipedia calls the Bally Astrocade. It was basically the 70s equivalent of the Neo Geo in that it offered arcade-quality games at an absurdly high price point. But it also had the worst branding in the entire history of video games. The console, the box the console came in, and the cartridges for the console each called the console something different. And what each of those things called the console would change from year to year. I'm not even making this up. And yet, one of the few things the console was never called was the Bally Astrocade. Recently, I decided to combine all of the logos into a single definitive master logo, which presents what I hope will one day become its proper canonical name, the Bally Astrocade, the Professional Arcade Videocade Home Library Computer System by Astrovision.
Has anyone ever discovered an unreleased video game that was actually fun to play?
I guess this question is for me. Yeah, so I've discovered a lot of unreleased games, and fun to play is fairly subjective. I would say that I've discovered many that are interesting, that have ideas worth looking at, that offer something to the world. I mean, I think Penn and Teller's Smoke and Mirrors is a really good example of that. But fun to play. I mean, Treasure's Tiny Toons game on the PS2 is kind of fun. There's some really janky NES games that I enjoy. I actually really like Drax Night Out, which is not a good game, but I enjoy playing it, so I think that counts. Well, there's Sound Fantasy for the Super Nintendo. That's a Toshio Iwai game. Some parts of that eventually came out as Sim Tunes by Maxis, but the original Nintendo version, Super Nintendo version, didn't come out. And it's a cool little music toy, kind of like Electroplankton. And there's some fun little Super NES mouse games in it. And it's something that was like done and fun, but my take was always that, that Nintendo just didn't want to deal with the mouse accessory for the Super Famicom anymore. There's kind of a, I don't say it's good, but fun-ish game for the Sega Genesis, Beethoven Second, or maybe it's just called Beethoven, but it's based on Beethoven Second, the movie, not the musical score. This is legitimately a Metroidvania starring Beethoven the dog, and you get new powers by rescuing lost puppies across the very open world map who can get you to new areas. Just inarguably a Metroidvania starring Beethoven the dog. There's a ROM online on Hidden Palace. It's not finished. I don't think you can actually beat it as is. I actually did rescue what seems to be a finished version of the game, and it's one of those things where I just keep forgetting I need to do something with it. So maybe this will make me do it. If you want to play Beethoven Metroidvania and get cranky at me on the forums, pay more money on Patreon and then do that. We'll make that a perk where you can yell at me.
Question 4. Earlier in the life of Insert Credit, Vincent Diamante and I got to play an arcade game for Adamus Wave called Sushi Bar. I feel like I'm just repeating everything. This episode is a greatest hits of things I always talk about. But anyway, Sushi Bar. It was real fun. It was a puzzle game. It never came out. It had all the juice already in it. It was fun, single player and multiplayer, but it never came out. And for years, I tried to get the board, to buy the board, because I found out that it was sitting in the lobby of High Moon Studios in San Diego when I went there to do some interviews and stuff. But I was never able to make that happen. And then years later, somebody got hold of a copy and released it, and it's still fun. So that's one. And also a kind of an odd one, but Colors for the Gizmondo, odd one from me anyway. Colors for the Gizmondo is actually quite a good Grand Theft Auto-like, and it's probably the Grand Theft Auto-like that I played the most, which I guess is not very unlike me to do something like that. I feel like it would have done well if it had been ported to the PS2 or something at the time. It's got a lot of problematic elements to it, of course, but I guess you expect that from one of these released in the early 2000s. But the action was good, the story was interesting and weird, and it had that kind of horror-themed drug sequence where you were chasing a white rabbit down a red corridor maze that was all disorienting and weird. That was pretty neat and strange.
I don't know as much about this as Frank does, so I'm just going to say Star Fox 2.
We'll be right back after a quick break. The following ad supports the Insert Credit podcast, but is not necessarily endorsed by its individual members. This is the Insert Credit Quick Break. I'm Alex Jaffe, and this week's episode of Insert Credit is sponsored by Amazing Grace. Where is my child? Amazing Grace is an action platformer about diving down from heaven and rescuing your child from hell. Run, jump, flap, and dash your way through the 9 circles of danger and collectibles. Fight demons and rescue the damned as you peel away layers of mystery and uncover a shocking truth that will change everything. Amazing Grace features bouncy 2D platforming action, a dynamic system of mid-air movement that lets you get some sick airtime, 24 levels, each with special achievement goals, 9 bosses, an original soundtrack featuring solos by stars of the Pico 8 music community. Amazing Grace is a passion project by a solo developer named Olivia, and you can beat it in 2 hours. It will come out on Steam and itch.io on June 6th at 6:66 p.m. That's 6/6 of this year at 6:66 p.m. Amazing Grace. Go to hell.
Hello everyone, it's me, Brandon Sheffield. I wanted to tell you that the Demonschool demo, Steam NextFest demo, is live right now, probably. I think so. And you should play it. NextFest is from the 10th to the 17th. It's on Steam. That's why they call it the Steam NextFest. It's long. Some people say it takes like 3 hours to beat. Hopefully we have saving and loading in there by the time you play it. Hopefully, probably. It's got mini games. It's got a lot of stuff. We're updating the game demo as we go. It's like a whole chunk of the game. The game is broken up into weeks, which are broken up into days. And this is one almost full week of the game. It's just missing the weekend. So you'll really get a good idea of whether you're gonna like it. And I'm really curious to hear what everybody thinks. So you should give feedback on the forum if you like. There's a Demonschool thread there. Would love if you played it and told me how long it took you to do, whether you liked it, all that kind of business. Oh, we also announced our release date, which is Friday the 13th, September 2024. That's pretty soon. Yeah, give it a look. Please, thanks. Bye forever.
Welcome back to Insert Credit. It's time to go to the dirt bag. This is the segment every episode where we take one of the questions submitted to us at patreon.com/insertcredit, where you, yes, you can get access to the forum that allows you to participate in this weekly segment. You also get access to monthly bonus episodes and other interesting surprises. This week's question comes from SpencerGifts, who asks, what is the best video game sequence that is no fun?
You know, I keep thinking about this question and I keep going back to The Last of Us, which is a game I never really found the fun in it. I understand that people have, and that's fine. I'm not going to argue against that, but I never thought the combat was particularly fun. And also, while I recognize that the story was really good, I was kind of bored by how it seemed to be a set of combat stages separated by movie sequences, and found myself just not liking either of those things. Maybe I'd enjoy the show. I don't know. But for me, like, I just keep thinking about that game, which I respect. It's just wonderfully, meticulously, presented. A lot of time and money and heart clearly went into it. It's like objectively a high quality video game, beloved by many, but I never found it to be fun. I never enjoyed playing it or watching the parts between when I was allowed to play it. So there.
I guess the word best is the critical part of this question because I could take that a lot of ways. I don't think that I personally enjoy very many video game sequences that aren't fun unless you count grinding, which isn't fun, but it's more of a brain turn-off thing, which I sometimes appreciate, if not enjoy. So I'm going to take best to mean iconic or notable. So with that in mind, I'll put forward the tube race in Battletoads, since it's such a go-to for everyone. And since it's responsive and almost tricks you into thinking that it's fair or could be fun, it's probably the best sequence in this regard because it fools and entices people into trying again. And it's also such a blockade to an otherwise relatively smooth game playing experience. And so you feel like if you can just get past that, you'll return to the fun part. But I also think maybe masochore platformers are probably this for somebody. The fun is in the fun that you're not having, sort of, where like it's subverting your expectations. At least that's how I see it. I'm sure it's pure fun for other people, but for me, it's like it's intentional anti-fun that is more fun to think about than actually experience and take into practice, put into practice, whatever.
You know, every speedrun I watch on Games Done Quick is so beyond entertaining, and yet also seems like something that would be an absolute nightmare for me to try to do myself. But my actual answer is the entirety of Dragon Slayer. Incredibly beautiful animation, but the only people who get to appreciate it are the people watching it. Because you have to concentrate on landing every single damn QuickTime event.
Is there a video game experience you missed out on that you wish you could have had?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we make fun of like British microcomputer games all the time on the Insert Credit Magazine show, but I legitimately wish that I had had the experience of growing up with microcomputers and sort of that culture where you could get a video game like as an impulse item at the grocery store. You know, like you could get like a $3 cassette called Blobby's Bloop Boy just as an impulse buy for like nothing. And that's just how games were distributed and sold to people. And I mean, first of all, you know, as someone who only had console games, I only ever owned like 4 games at a time in my childhood. And it would have been cool to have more. But second, I don't know, I might have been inspired to make my own in a sort of like garage dev budget game environment. And I'm not saying that like straight up what we have right now is an even better version of that. Like I can go on Steam and get 1 million games that are 1 million times better than that trash ever was for about the same price now, not even adjusted for inflation. Like we have it way better now, but I wish I had grown up in a culture where you could pluck video game cartridges off the tree and play something miserable and then grow up to make YouTube top 20 videos about your Stockholm syndrome and how you pretend to like when Ocean did a bad port of a Taito arcade game or something. That could be me.
This is going to be a short one for me. In some ways, I wish I had put some significant time into an MMO, but I don't think I ever will at this point. I just don't have the time for it. But otherwise, I'm pretty sure that I have had every other video game experience that was ever created across time. The end. No, not the end. I think the rest of the video game experiences that I haven't had, I intentionally have not had, like VR. I'm just not into it. I don't want to do it. I don't have any regrets about not playing serious games. I think that's fine. You know, I don't need to learn how to do a colonoscopy with the little snaky tube and whatever. I don't need to talk about it. Bye.
It might have been fun to play Rock Band with a group of friends back when people were still into that. I never got around to buying any plastic instruments until they were all being clearanced off.
When shouldn't you have a pause button?
In general, I think video games should always have the ability to pause. They shouldn't be the only home medium where you can't pause and walk away if, like, someone's at the door or, like, I don't know, your child's drowning. Like, I think that should always be an option. But I appreciate that there's some dramatic moments where authorship might dictate that you do not want the player to pause during this part. And I do sympathize with that. And I'm wondering if there might be some language we haven't invented yet that tips the player off. That, I don't know, there might be a little countdown timer saying that, like, hey, in 10 seconds, this will become unpausable for a while. So you might want to consider pausing now, right? Like, maybe you do the thing where cutscenes just put the black bars on top and bottom, right? To say this is a movie. But maybe, like, they start slowly doing that. Like, it takes 10 seconds for the bars to fill in. And during that 10 seconds, you can pause. And then once the bars are filled in, you can't anymore. And it's like, this is the last rest stop for 15 miles on the freeway of video games. I just answered a future insert credit question, didn't I?
You shouldn't have a pause button when you're playing PC Engine or TurboGrafx games because then it's a run button. You should have a pause button when you're playing PS5 or Xbox Series X games because those are ambiguously named and they're ambiguous to look at and they're basically just redirects from what we all know is really a pause button. So put those ones back in, IMO. Please, thanks. In games themselves, though, I think you should always have a pause button. Why not? I think if you want to, in scare quotes, ruin a dramatic cutscene for yourself, you should be able to do that. I'm thinking about cool action sequences with time pressure, countdowns where you have to quickly make a decision, and I think you should be able to pause in all of them. I really don't think there's a context in which you shouldn't have one. Just go ahead and give it. I think one of the most interesting uses of a pause button is when it causes weird behavior that can then be exploited in a tool-assisted speedrun. That's pretty fun. Also, I just heard about like Time Splitters 2. There's something where if you leave it on the pause screen for too long, it starts yelling at you. That's silly. I don't know if I like that or if I don't.
I know there's a clever, funny answer to this one, but all I can think of is online multiplayer matches.
What can we learn about women if our only reference point is video games from the 1980s?
Wow, from the 80s specifically. Okay, I'm someone whose only reference to women is video games of the 1980s. Okay, they just get kidnapped, like, all the time. They just get held against their will in, like, a castle or, like, a closet or, like, a closet inside of a castle. And mean guys take them and put them there. And then they have to wait until the nicer guy comes and punches the mean guy enough. And then they could rescue the woman from the place that she doesn't actually want to be, from the closet. And as far as I can tell, that's about all they do. They do a couple more things. Like, sometimes there's ladies that are roaming the streets with whips and they hit you with them because they don't want you to get the nice lady out of the closet. They want the nice lady to stay in the closet. So they're out on the streets being bad ladies that prevent closet rescues. That's another kind of lady. Is that it? I mean, like, you can't really learn anything from Miss Pac-Man because she just behaves exactly like Pac-Man, except she eats better food. So she's a little healthier, I think, more produce. So I guess there's something you can get from there. I think that's all the women in 80s games. They're either in closets waiting to be rescued, they're outside of the closets preventing the closeted ones from being rescued, or they're just kind of going about their day eating cherries. I think that about covers it.
So I don't love this question because it leads us to say a lot of ironic stuff about how they were all helpless and useless because that's how they were often designed or depicted in games at the time. So I'm going to take it another way and talk about how a lot of women were making pioneering games at the time, like Donna Bailey with Centipede, Danny Button-Berry with Mule, Roberta Williams with King's Quest, Ryuko Kodama with Phantasy Star, but also lesser-known folks like Hiroko Yokoyama, who worked on illustrations for Ikari Warriors and Crystallis. So in that view, you can learn whatever else you could learn about women in the 80s. They were doing a lot of stuff, but not necessarily being given their due at the time. That's what I got to say about that.
I guess people's takeaway would be that women are quick, but have less strength and or hit points. But you have to watch out for the queen in battle chess, who will destroy you. Thankfully, women are extremely rare, only 1 to 14 men in chess, and even fewer elsewhere. No wonder this person can only learn about them from video games.
With that, it's time to go on to our lightning round. This week, we're playing a game called Name Redesign. The following is a partial list of video games cited in the Wikipedia article, List of Commercial Failures in Video Games. You're going to help each of them by giving them a more appealing title. Our first game is APB, All Points Bulletin.
Shoot City.
APB, more like No Points Bulletin, blasted.
I think the real problem with most of these examples has more to do with concept than branding. For example, this first one is basically half of you will have to play as cops, the game.
Beyond Good and Evil.
Unambiguously evil.
Beyond Good and Evil, Mr. Pig's Day Off.
Beyond Good and Evil. A furry world where furry players aren't allowed to play as furry characters, the game.
Duke Nukem Forever.
Duke Nukem Eventually.
Duke Nukem Forever. Always bet on Duke. I actually legitimately think that would have been a good name for a Duke Nukem game. They should probably still do that.
Duke Nukem Forever. You're going to regret buying this, the game.
Earthbound.
Mother 2.
Earthbound, Mother 2, LOL.
Earthbound. You're going to regret not buying this, the game.
Kingdoms of Amalur, Reckoning.
I just combined things. Fantasy Quest Online.
Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, Big Baseball Man, Big Money.
Kingdoms of Amalur, Reckoning. You could literally pick words out of a hat and end up with a better title than this generic gobbledygook bullshit. I just opened up a random word generator and it gave me export, interrupt, duck. Export, interrupt, duck. Instantly a better title.
The Last Express.
A Murder on the Orient Express. No, a different one.
Last Express. I've been watching the Poirot TV series lately, so I will say Agatha Christie's The Last Express. I actually think that would be good, even though it's not, it's not belonging to her in any way.
I think The Last Express is a great title, though admittedly, it might have sold better if they'd named it Final Mystery.
Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite.
Comic books versus video games.
Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, more like Marvel vs. Capcom Unfunit.
Marvel vs. Capcom 4.
Okami.
Okami Dog. I mean, it's definitely Okami Dog. I'm not the only one who's saying Okami Dog. We know it's true.
Okami. Mr. Wolf's Day Off.
Okami. Wolf Mother.
Shenmue.
I wouldn't change this one. I like how evocative it is. So, and I don't even know if it means anything, honestly. So if I had to rename it, I might just go for his last name. I might call it Hakazuki or Ryo.
Shenmue, Virtua Townie.
Shenmue, Through the Fire and Flames.
And finally, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League.
I mean, it's already ironic because Warner Brothers sent them all out to die. They sent the Suicide Squad out onto Steam to go die, and they did. So I think it's a pretty good title already, but I don't know, if I were in charge of the franchise and you just put a gun to my head and said just make a title, I would I'd just go Suicide Squad : the video game. 2 words.
Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, Batman's Best Buddies.
Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. Executive meddling kills the Suicide Squad. The game.
Now's the part of the show where we take recommendations. If you've got a recommendation for our audience of something you're interested in or enjoying, or would like to plug something you're involved in or working on, now is the time to do that.
I don't know if there's a recommendation per se, but I just feel the need to express somewhere that recently at the Video Game History Foundation, we had a visitor, Craig Stitt. Craig is one of the co-creators of Spyro the Dragon. He wrote the initial game design document and he did the initial character designs and stuff like that. They didn't actually end up using his Spyro, but, it was his concept. He colored Spyro. He did all of the skies in the game, which are really, really nice. Good artist, very talented guy. He also did, which level? Oh, he did Oil Ocean Zone in Sonic 2. So neat little trivia there. But anyway, I went home and played Spyro for the first time. And I'm not saying go out of your way to play it, but I just want to express somewhere that, man, that's actually a pretty fun game. I think that it's a game that really, really understands the PlayStation. It makes that system feel a lot more capable than it is. It does a lot of neat magic tricks. I think the way it masks loading different levels is so cool. The way that, it always has the other zones sky loaded in, and it kind of moves the camera so you just see the bottom of Spyro flying into that sky, and then the camera pans out and then is suddenly over the level that was loading invisibly in the background. I think that's so cool, and it feels decent to run around. Probably felt amazing back then, a little dated now, but Spyro the Dragon, think about it.
For recommendations, Scavenger's Reign is on Netflix now. I recommended it when it was on Max, but now it's on Netflix, and you gotta watch it. You gotta watch it. It's the only way it's gonna get a season 2. It's not looking good right now. Just watch it. If I had Netflix, I would just rewatch the whole thing right now so that I could increase its popularity by 1 digit. But everyone's got to do it because that show rules. It's a weird, kind of quiet sci-fi thing about people being on a strange planet where all the creatures in the environment is kind of alive and connected in a way that just feels really cool and inventive. And every episode is designed to kind of surprise you, give you a little surprise treat, but not in a way that's like a mystery or I'm losing my words here, but it shows you surprises that make sense, which you didn't have prior information for, but you don't mind not having prior information about it. It's like, oh, these things do this. That's neat. That's what it's all about. If you want to be thinking, well, that's neat, every 30 seconds to 5 minutes, depending on the pacing of the episode, Scavenger's Reign is for you. I did my little advertisement about playing Demonschool because I didn't think I was going to be on this show, but then I did it. I'm here now. So check it out. I hope you have a good time in your life generally. We're going to be back to a normal episode pretty soon, I hope. Thanks for bearing with us. Bye forever from me.
I have 2 recommendations. My first recommendation is a video called Why Backstory and Lore Make Bad Story Trailers by Derek Liu. Liu has professionally edited trailers for games like Firewatch, Psychonauts 2, and Half-Life Alyx, and his video has a ton of great advice. My second recommendation is me, my stuff. I research and write about forgotten video game history. Have you ever wanted to know how many games had Easter eggs before Atari Adventure because Ready Player One lied to you? Have you ever wanted to know why the first playable female characters of the 80s were naked? The video I'm currently editing is about the history and evolution of the word Metroidvania and will feature voice cameos from Jeremy Parrish, Scott Sharkey, Christian Nutt, and more. You can find my work by going to acriticalhit.com with an A at the front because I couldn't get just regular Critical Hit. Alternatively, you can go to YouTube and search for Critical Kate. You can also go to Blue Sky and search for Critical Kate. And if you'd like to help financially support a trans creator during Pride Month, please consider donating to my Patreon by searching for Critical Kate.
Well, I've got some recommendations. I'd like to recommend if you enjoyed this or any episode of Insert Credit, please rate and review our show wherever and however you can. You can also support us on patreon.com/insertcredit to pay everyone involved in this show, Tim Rogers excluded. If you'd like to sponsor our show with an advertisement or personal message, it's easy and affordable to do that. Just contact us at show@insertcredit.com. You can also join our community at forums.insertcredit.com or find us on youtube.com/insertcreditshow. This episode is edited by Esper Quinn with original music by Kurt Feldman. I'm Alex Jaffe.
I'm Frank Cifaldi.
I'm Brandon Sheffield.
I'm Critical Kate Willaert.
And there ain't no getting off of this train we're on.
I'm Frank Cifaldi. I'm Frank Cifaldi. I'm Frank Cifaldi. I'm Frank Cifaldi. I'm Frank Cifaldi.